Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Nonprofit Watchdogs, What Finance Teams Need to Know. I'd like to go through a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. You can maximize or minimize the webinar pane during the presentation by using the red arrow buttons. During the webinar, we also encourage you to ask questions. In the webinar pane, you'll see a chat box that you can use to enter your questions. Just type out your question and click Submit. Our presenters will answer those questions as time allows, either during the webinar or during our Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Second, to ensure good audio quality, please check your settings to ensure the appropriate option is selected. If you're using a telephone, please click on the Use Telephone Audio mode. If you're listening through your computer, then please click on the Use Mic and Speaker options. Now for a quick review of our California CE requirements. To qualify for California CE, you must use a personal computer, no PDAs, and log in with your own information and unique URL. You must be logged into our online software for at least 50 consecutive minutes within the scheduled time frame of the webinar. You must actively respond to at least 75% of the polling questions. There are 4, which means you will need to answer 3, and you must complete the evaluation survey at the end of the webinar. And now a quick intro to our presenters. First up is Michael Bolton. We call him Mike around here. Audit Senior Manager with Armanino. He specializes in financial statement audits, reviews, and compilations, as well as general accounting and consulting for nonprofit organizations, including private education, foundations, religious organizations, and performing arts. Next up is Dean Quiambo, partner with Armanino. Dean helps numerous private schools, social service organizations, performing arts, and faith-based orgs address their tax, audit, and outsourced accounting needs. Boards, finance, and audit committees have benefited from his laser focus on bringing to life the audit items that matter most. Now, a quick review of our learning objectives. During today's webinar, you'll examine Charity Navigator's current rating system, discuss the effect fundraising and other essential functions have on each rating, and review what CFOs need to know about watchdog ratings. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dean.
Thanks, Debbie. Thank you, everyone, for logging in today and hearing my voice again. I feel like I've been doing a lot of these webinars lately, but that is our commitment here at Armanino, to continue to add value to the nonprofit community. So I really hope that everyone is really getting a lot of value and information out of these. So today, it's going to be a lot about nonprofit watchdogs, and the one that we're going to focus on is Charity Navigator. So we'll kind of walk through, understand the why behind what their background is and what their intent. We'll talk about ratings and how that impacts your nonprofit's perception. And we'll actually go through the rating calculation and see how that is done. And then we'll kind of end up with some conclusions, what's next, and how we at Armanino might be able to help.
Yeah, and Dean, I'll just add for context for everybody that, as Dean mentioned, while we're focusing on Charity Navigator, because that's by far the most prominent watchdog out there for the nonprofit community, there's certainly other watchdog type organizations that are important for you to be aware of. Just to name a few for context: the Better Business Bureau of Wise Giving Alliance, Charity Watch, orghunter.com, which is actually a unique one because it allows you to log on and kind of tell your story and leave comments of why you have that particular rating. And lastly, GuideStar. Although they're not providing ratings, they are allowing donors to collect lots of information on your organization and make those decisions. So, but again, we'll focus on Charity Navigator throughout.
Yeah, that seems like the more prominent one. So first off, let's kind of understand the why. Let's walk through that, Mike.
Yeah, so we certainly wanted to give some context for you and some background on Charity Navigator if you aren't too familiar with them. A lot of people know the name, but there's certainly some background details that are important to understand. First and foremost, they are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, just as most of you are. So that's important to realize. And their mission is essentially to guide intelligent giving. So they're very, very heavily focused on the donor and informing the donor and arming them with information to make the best decision on whether to fund your organization or to participate in programs. Charity Navigator does rate about 8,000 to 10,000 different nonprofit organizations throughout the U.S., organizations that are located in the U.S., even though they may have operations internationally. So while 8,000 to 10,000 is definitely quite a few, certainly not all nonprofit organizations qualified to be rated. We're aware of at least over 1 million nonprofit organizations are registered in the U.S. with the IRS, so there's quite a few more than are being rated. And the reason for that is some pretty stringent requirements to qualify. And I'll go through some of those for you in case you're curious why you may not qualify to be rated, or if you do hit some of these, we'll talk about how you can become rated if you're not yet. So first, the first requirement is that you are a 501c3 organization and that you file a Form 990. So right off the bat, that excludes most religious nonprofit organizations since they're exempt from filing a Form 990. They also don't rate private foundations or any of the nonprofit organizations who file a Form 990-EZ. And the real reason for all of this is they need to collect as much data as possible, and we'll walk you through that on what they're looking for. So they can't have these forms that are the short form and excluding certain information. They want to make sure it's comparable between organizations. Some of the other requirements that they go through when they're looking at potential organizations to rate, I mentioned it's heavily donor focused, so you need to be primarily supported by donor contributions as opposed to self-supported through program fees. At the very least, you need to have $500,000 of donor contributed funds over the past 2 years, and generally more than $1 million of total revenue from all sources over the same 2-year period. You need to have 7 years of Form 990s available. So if you're a relatively new nonprofit organization, you won't qualify to be rated until that 7th year is made available to the public. Lastly, you need to have some form of fundraising effort in your organization. So if you're an organization that has 0 fundraising expenditures, you're immediately disqualified. Again, they're trying to make this a donor-focused rating system, and so you need to be soliciting donations as well as receiving and be primarily supported by those donors. And lastly, you can't be supported primarily from government funding, same reason. So you can kind of get the theme here, heavily donor-focused, both in incoming funds and solicitation of those funds. Why Charity Navigator ratings are important and how they're being used in the marketplace, this is obviously pretty quick. Donors are looking at these. Grantors are looking you up online. They're checking your rating to get that quick feeling of an assessment of your organization. So it's out there. And as Dean mentioned, these are watchdog organizations, so it's also important for you to realize that someone is out there making an independent assessment of your organization, and you should be aware of that and certainly acting on it.
Right, and to the extent that you can manage that, you should. So let's see. Let's talk about your rating and the impact on what that could mean for your organization.
Yeah, so we'll start diving in here kind of slowly. We'll talk on the surface here, the rating system, and we'll certainly get into the details and the underlying assumptions and calculations that Charity Navigator performs. But at the highest level, which some of you may be familiar here as you see on the screen, is their 4-star rating system. So organizations that do qualify will get rated on this 4-star scale. The best rating is a 4-star qualification, meaning you have an exceptional rating, you're exceeding industry standards, you're outperforming your peer organizations in your same cause or sector of the nonprofit community. And then it tailors downward. So 3-star is a good rating, a 2-star slightly needs improvement. Both those ratings, maybe you're meeting industry standards or slightly underperforming against your peer groups. And we'll talk about the details of those 2 ratings because you can oscillate between each one in a given year. A 1-star rating is what they're considering a poor nonprofit and failing to meet the basic industry standards for your sector. They do provide a 0-star rating, which would be exceptionally poor and far below the industry standards. And some of these terminology will kind of make sense to you as we look at the numbers and some of the financial metrics that would qualify for a poor versus a good rated organization. And lastly, important to note that they do have a donor advisory rating. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute, but that is essentially a red flag on a nonprofit and addresses serious concerns that have been raised, and we'll talk about some of those. But that does mean you've qualified to be rated, but they're not going to actually assign a rating because of a donor advisory. So as we get into a little bit more of the rating system here, I mentioned the 4-star system, which is really the most understood and most prominent face of the Charity Navigator rating. But underlying those star ratings is a numerical score, and it's made up of 2 components. Accountability and transparency is one, and your financial health score is the second. Both scores are out of a total 100-point rating, and essentially comparing them both, you can see here on the table If you have a 90-point financial score and a roughly 80-point accountability and transparency, that maps to a 3-star organization. So to be a 4-star organization, you need to be firing on both cylinders, 90 points or above in each category. So you can see both of these categories are very important. You can't suffer financially, but be outstanding from a transparency perspective and still expect to be receiving a high score.
But you know what jumps off the page to me right here, Mike, is the fact that to an extent, accountability and transparency, the organization can control, right? Financial health, we know that there's a lot of ebbs and flows there, and obviously you can do your best to strategic plan for that. But the accountability and the transparency piece feels like an area that you can control.
Absolutely, and we'll talk about some of the components of that, and some of them, in our opinion, are easy wins. If you're not doing some of these, you can implement them now and increase that score that's completely in your control. What else is interesting about this structure of the scoring system in these two categories is for many years, these are basically the core components of any measurement of success for a nonprofit. Are you transparent to your community, and are you financially strong? What it doesn't include is that measurement of community impact. And we'll talk about that later, about some things Charity Navigator is looking at in the future to measure that. But these are consistent with how we've always looked at success for a nonprofit.
Okay.
So we wanted to give a little bit of context for you. We talked about the 4 stars, the numerical score underlying it. Obviously, the greatest accomplishment, at least for this rating system, is to be a 4-star rated nonprofit. So what does that really mean? And I wanted to give you context of if you are a 4-star rated organization, that you're in pretty good company. Maybe if you're on the cusp, if you're a 3-star organization and you're maybe fearful that there's a lot of work ahead to try to increase that. The reality is there's not that many organizations in front of you. So to give you some context, in all of Charity Navigator's database nationwide, there's 2,400 4-star rated organizations across all sectors. I mentioned before they rate roughly 8,000 to 10,000 organizations. So about a quarter are hitting that 4-star rating in any given year. Now we know most of you are here in California, so for some details on the California 4-star rated organizations, 27 are in the social services sector, 25 in the youth or shelter crisis services type of nonprofit. If you're an arts organization, especially if you're a museum, this one was interesting to me. There's only 12 museums in the state of California that have a 4-star Charity Navigator rating. So you're in good company if you're one of those. Same with an education sector, 1 of 14 if you have a 4-star rating. So I was surprised by this. I thought there'd be more 4-star rated orgs in these different sectors. So if you are one of those, it's something definitely to be proud of. So a little bit more on impact of your perception. First and foremost, this rating is absolutely public. It's out there for everybody to see. You don't need a membership. You don't need a subscription to Charity Navigator. You can log on, type in an organization's name, and immediately see the star rating. And I think what's important for you all to understand is everybody's busy, and if a donor just wants a quick snapshot of your organization and a measurement of your success, so to speak, they might just log on and see that star rating and make a decision from that alone without diving into the details behind it. So very important to realize that it's out there, it's public, and that watchdog organization is making that independent assessment of your financials and transparency. I mentioned before donor advisory, and that's the lowest level of rating on the hierarchy for Charity Navigator. So I wanted to give a little bit more color for that and some background and what really qualifies organizations to unfortunately be rated a donor advisory. So Charity Navigator started their 4-star system in 2002. It took a while, but in 2010 they implemented the donor advisory, really based on feedback from the donor community of concerns around if an organization is implementing poor practices or in litigation or anything like that matter. So some of the triggers that would put you into a donor advisory, if you're under investigation by the Attorney General, that's typically automatically a donor advisory rating. If you're in significant lawsuits pending or settled that are communicated on your Form 990, that'll trigger a donor advisory. Also, what they call any suspicious item on your Form 990. So obviously that's judgmental. I think the takeaway there is if there's an item on your Form 990 that's confusing or open to interpretation, that could be flagged as suspicious, and they might trigger a donor advisory rating. So there's anywhere from 3 to 15 roughly donor advisories posted every month. Again, I was surprised by that number. So they're adding 3 to 15 new donor advisories on a monthly basis. And at this point in time, there's roughly 300 organizations nationwide flagged as donor advisory in the database. So quite a few, but it can come and go. They'll release a donor advisory if one of those triggering events lapses or goes away. They will then implement the normal star rating after that. Next, in terms of impact on your perception, at least in a positive way, we absolutely want to encourage everybody, if you are one of those 3-star rated organizations or a 4-star rated organization, make that excellent rating known. Make sure you're communicating that in your marketing collateral. Tell your board members, put it on your website. I don't think we see that quite as much as could be communicated. It's a great positive note for your organization, so definitely put it out there and make sure everyone knows.
Yeah, you earned it.
Exactly. Yeah, be proud of it. Lastly, if you're not rated, I mentioned that before, some of the criteria to be rated are fairly stringent, but if you're on the cusp, so maybe you're a new nonprofit, you're 6 years in, if you recall, I mentioned you have to have 7 years of Form 990. So if you're about to trigger that, naturally, there's a lot of organizations that are rating, so it takes some time. But if you're not rated, just be aware that you can go online, search your organization name. You'll pull up. You just won't have a rating yet, but you can vote. So you can grab Charity Navigator's attention and expedite that process by having enough people go in and vote to want to see that rating. So we've seen experience with organizations doing that, having their board members do a rating, their significant donors go in and do a vote to generate that rating earlier than maybe it would have happened.
Mike, I'm hearing a lot about rating, and it seems like that's your star rating and Charity Navigator are starting to become very synonymous. Is there anything else of value that someone can get besides just their rating from Charity Navigator?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. So they're most known for the rating system, but they certainly publish other information. One example is CEO compensation. That's a public data point on your Form 990. Of course, some organizations leave it blank, but that would not be appropriate or within the rules of the IRS guidelines. But when you do publish that, they populate that on your profile on the Charity Navigator website. Other interesting items that I've seen that they're publishing are some top 10 lists. So these are good and bad. They'll publish a top 10 list of the most consistently 4-star rated organizations. So for example, Southern California, Goodwill of Southern California. They've been a 4-star rated organization for 15 years running. So they're on the top 10 list. Great publicity for them. Top 10 most viewed organizations. They're publicizing that. On the other hand, some negative top 10 lists. They actually have a top 10 list of the most highly compensated nonprofit CEOs with a low rated financial health. So they're putting it out there if there's that mismatch of a highly comped CEO, but perhaps a poorly financially run organization. So be aware of that.
So thanks, Mike. Now we're going to turn to our first polling question. As a reminder for those of you who are here for CE, you'll need to answer 3 of the 4 questions, so please take note. First question is, which of the following is not a Charity Navigator scored or ranked category? Is it A, accountability and transparency, B, financial health, C, operating expenses, or D, not sure? And for those of you who are wondering if you're going to get a copy of our slides from today or a recording of the presentation, rest assured I will be emailing that out to you by end of day today. So keep a watch for that. If you haven't answered, get your answers in, and we'll close the polls here in 3, 2, and 1. And it looks like about 90%, give or take, said operating expenses. So
yeah, which is great. Looks like we got a smart group on the viewers here. To reiterate, yeah, the 2 primary categories that are rated are accountability and transparency and financial health. By no means does this mean that operating expenses are ignored. You'll start to see as we look at some of the metrics within financial health, operating expenses certainly play a role, but not one of the core pillars of their rating system.
Speaking of the rating system, let's get to it. We got a lot of meat right here in the webinar. Let's figure out how this rating calculation comes to play.
Yeah, great. So what we'll do here is, again, we'll go through the two pillars. We'll start with accountability and transparency and start diving in and peeling back the layers here so you can understand some of the calculations and the analysis going on behind the scenes in Charity Navigator. So first, in this category, what they're doing is they're taking 17, we'll call them subcategories or characteristics to analyze within accountability and transparency. The overall goal here is, are you explaining your actions to stakeholders? So that's the accountability side. And are you making critical data available to the public? That's obviously the transparency side. So they're trying to touch on both of those concepts heavily. Of the 17 categories that are being analyzed, what they're doing is splitting them up. Five items come straight off your website, and we'll go through those in detail. 12 of the items come directly off your Form 990. Important to note there, we haven't mentioned yet, it's off your most recent 990. So sometimes these ratings can be somewhat delayed because it's based off your most current filing, which can sometimes be 9 to 12 months in the past. Important to note, this category, as I mentioned before, both pillars have 100 points. What they do for accountability and transparency is pretty nice. They start off, you start with 100 points. Everybody's a winner from the beginning, and they start deducting points as we go through some of these specific items.
All right, let's see them.
So we'll start with the heavier side of it. I mentioned 12 come from the 990, 5 come from the website. We'll go through the 990 first. What we'll do is we'll talk through each of these, and as I mentioned, if you're not meeting one of these items, they're deducting points from your overall 100-point score. So we'll touch on, again, I mentioned before, some of these are easy wins, so if you're not necessarily meeting these, it's easy to change that path. The first three are absolutely the most critical. Each of them can deduct anywhere about 15 points each if you're not meeting these items. First is independent board. First and foremost, they want to make sure that you do have an independent board of directors, but they also want to make sure that you have at least 5. So if you don't have 5 independent board members, maybe you have a small board of 3, they're deducting 15 points right off the bat from your 100-point opportunity. They also, another layer to that is even if you have 10 or 15 board members, if there's not enough to constitute a voting majority, they'll tweak it that way as well. But for the most part, just make sure your board is 5 or more. The next most critical item, material diversion of assets. So if you don't know what that is, that's embezzlement, that's theft. If that does happen in your nonprofit, there's an item on your Form 990, it's a yes/no answer. If it occurred, and you would check that box, what Charity Navigator is doing is not necessarily deducting you for that having happened, but the Form 990 leaves an open dialog box to explain what happened, how you've corrected the matter. So if you had a material diversion of assets but left that explanation blank, they're deducting 15 points. So again, that transparency. Are you making the public aware of what happened and what you're doing to right the ship? If you did have a material diversion of assets, and even if you did explain it, they're still going to deduct a few points, 6 or 7 points, but because obviously that's a negative item. But at the very least, make sure you're explaining what happened. The third most critical one is audited financial statements. So if you're not familiar, typically for California nonprofit organizations, you need to obtain independent audited financial statements if you have $2 million or more of revenue, with some exceptions, but that's the general rule of thumb. What Charity Navigator wants to know is, did you receive audited financial statements? And if you did, was the independent accountant governed by an audit committee or a committee of the board of directors? That's probably the more crucial point. They want to make sure that there is some governance of that audit process. So make sure if you are getting audited financial statements, you have an audit committee designated from your board. They're meeting with the auditors at least once a year, if not twice, to go through those communications. The next item, loans to or from related parties. I wouldn't say this is uncommon really in any industry, but the nonprofit community. If you obtained a loan from the CEO or a board member to float cash for a couple months during the year because cash was tight. That happens. You would need to disclose that on your Form 990. Unfortunately, Charity Navigator sees that as a negative. And if you had any loans from officers or interested parties, they're going to deduct 4 points from that 100-point rating. Board meeting minutes. This is one of those ones I mentioned as an easy win. You have a board of directors, you're required to. They're meeting undoubtedly, having discussions about your organization. Make sure you take meeting minutes. You can record the meeting, you can take notes. One of the board members can act as the secretary. There isn't a need for a lot of overhead for this to happen. So make sure you're keeping those meeting minutes. This is an easy win. It's 4 points on the 100-point scale. Copy of your Form 990. The requirement here is that the governing board sees the Form 990 before it is filed. That's a requirement on an annual basis. It's a yes/no answer on your Form 990. Did the governing board see the Form 990 before it was filed? You should always be able to check yes. They should always be reviewing this. This is their fiduciary responsibility as directors of your organization. Again, easy win. Conflict of interest policy is the 7th one of these 12. This is another easy one. You should have a conflict of interest policy in place. Your board of directors should be reviewing that on an annual basis, signing the conflict of interest every year. If you don't have a conflict of interest policy, that's something to get in place as soon as possible. Same with the second one, a whistleblower policy. This is an opportunity for your staff members or anybody involved with the organization to communicate any unusual activity they're seeing, or if they have concerns about transactions or things going on within the organization, that there's an appropriate path for them to communicate that and make it aware. That's a policy. It doesn't have to be a daunting task. It can be a one-pager policy. That there's plenty of templates out there, but you can put in place.
And Mike, specifically with regards to 7 and 8, we covered these pretty in depth in our board governance webinar a month or two ago. And I would say that, yeah, when you're looking at board governance, those two really jump off the page and really should spend some time on. I would say that you should definitely leverage, if you don't have that material, you should definitely leverage your partners that you work with and see if they can't provide it to you. We at Armanino, we have lots of templates that we can provide, and I think it's a big value. So definitely make sure you're working with an expert there.
Absolutely. Yep. The 9th one here of the 12 is record retention and destruction policy. Charity Navigator wants to make sure that you do have that policy in place. So if you don't, they're deducting 4 points. Again, an easy one. As any corporate entity should have a policy for record retention. Generally speaking, 7 years is perfectly fine, and then you can destroy those records. Number 10, on the 990, another box that you would check is CEO compensation. And as I mentioned before, that's a requirement to publicize or at least make transparent the CEO's compensation. And if you're leaving that blank, they're deducting points off your score as well. Related to that, the second to last one here is the process for determining the CEO's compensation. If you do not have a formal process for reviewing and updating your CEO or your executive director's compensation plan, they're deducting points. This is something that, again, the board should be involved with on an annual basis. Doesn't need to take a lot of time, but they should be evaluating the compensation, not only for just best practices, but making sure it's robust enough given industry standards and benchmarking of other organizations of your size and complexity. And the last is a listing of your board members. If you are a board member, you've certainly seen your name on a Form 990. If you're filling out your Form 990, you've had to collect those names and make sure they're listed. So Charity Navigator wants to make sure you're listing every board member that was involved with the organization for the year. They also want to see if any compensation was given to those board members. Most nonprofits do have volunteer board members, but if they are providing compensation, you should be listing that there on the Form 990, and Charity Navigator is certainly going to take notice of that. Next, we'll move on to the second component of the accountability and transparency pillar of the rating system. We went through all the 990 characteristics. Now, what they're doing is pulling 5 items straight from your website. So obviously you should have a website, and then when you have that established, these are the 5 key items that you need in order for Charity Navigator to be giving you the highest rating for transparency. First being, again, a board member list. We talked about that on the Form 990, but they also want all your board members listed on the website, again, so donors can see the names, the relationships, the qualifications of your directors for the organization. Secondly is key staff. It doesn't have to be every employee of the organization, just the key, executives or management team listed on the website. Their qualifications, their background is always nice to elaborate on as well. 3 and 4 are the sensitive ones, to be honest. Audited financial statements in your Form 990. Depending on the organization, the background, or your programs, you may or may not be posting your financial statements and your 990 filing on your website. Just be aware that if you don't post it, Charity Navigator does look for that, and they'll deduct points off the rating for transparency for those not being available to your donor base.
I think that's an area where it really helps to work with someone. You make sure your accounting firm is really an expert in nonprofits, so they can look at your audited financials and they can look at your 990 and say, hey, these are the areas that really matter. These are the things that would put you guys in the best possible light. And if you worked with someone who just maybe works with a couple nonprofits rather than specializes in nonprofits, I think you could be putting yourself at risk there.
Absolutely, that's a great point. The last one from the website is privacy policy. What they're getting at here is donors have expressed concern, and rightfully so, that when they participate with your organization or make donations online, that their information, personal information, is sold off to marketing companies and so on. So you should have a privacy policy in place. And if you do not have a privacy policy for your donors, they're deducting 4 points from your score. And important to also note that if you do have a privacy policy, but it's an opt-out policy, they'll still deduct 3 points from your score. And what we mean by that is it should be an opt-in policy, ideally, where donors would opt in to allow for you to share their information. If it's kind of a de facto policy, that's a negative connotation as well, and points will be deducted. Important to note from this group of the website characteristics, it's 21 of the 100 total possible points for the accountability and transparency grouping. The 990 items we went through was the other 89 points. So heavily weighted on the 990, but these are also some of the easy items you can post on your website in order to boost up that score.
Thanks, Mike. And that brings us to polling question number 2. Again, for those of you here for CE, you need to answer 3 of the 4. So if by chance you missed the first one, make sure you answer this one. Question: of the 17 categories scored within accountability and transparency, where does Charity Navigator focus their analysis? Is it A, the nonprofit's website, B, the nonprofit's Form 990, C, both A and B, or D, not sure? And while we're on the topic of CE, for those of you who are waiting for CE in your certificate, you'll be receiving that within 3 business days of the webinar. And again, I'll be sending the slides later today. Let's get those answers in. We'll close this poll in 3, 2, and 1. And it looks like about 3/4 got that right, Mike.
Yeah, that's great. Certainly the correct answer is both website and Form 990. So and we've gone through both of the characteristics for those. I'll take this a quick point to answer a question that came in as we were talking through some of the board listings and what's the transparency for your website and your Form 990. One of the participants asked if the executive committee would be sufficient with respect to the board listing. And what I would say is certainly put that up there. When in doubt, at least put up some of your executive committee members as opposed to no board listing. They're not very clear on whether that would differentiate between a board member listing or executive committee, but if I were you, definitely put that up just to be safe. So we talked about accountability and transparency, which was one of the 2 primary categories for the rating system. The second is financial health. So this is the nuts and bolts of your organization's financial position and your performance, and some of the key financial performance metrics that Charity Navigator looks at. What they do here is take 7 scores. They're each up to 10 points each, so 70 total possible points for the financial health metrics. Everybody gets a padding of 30 points to bring it to the total 100 to add compare with the 100 points for the accountability and transparency category. With these financial health metrics, what Charity Navigator is trying to measure are really 2 items: financial efficiency and, secondly, financial capacity. And we'll go through each of these metrics that meet both of those goals. So the first couple financial metrics that Charity Navigator looks at address that financial efficiency goal that they're trying to rate for your organization. The first metric they're looking at is program expenses, and for here, the higher your score, the better. All they're trying to measure is if what percent of your programmatic function to total expenses. So if your total expenses is comprised of 90% in your program, the expenses going directly into meeting your mission, then you would receive 9 points out of the 10 for that metric. So the higher the number, the better. Important to note that if for some reason your organization has less than a third, 33% program expense to total expenses, you automatically have 0 points. So you at least need to have a third allocated to the program function. Should be pretty easy. Most nonprofits we've seen are certainly upwards in the 2/3, 70%, 80%, upwards of 90%, depending on the type of organization. I will note on the program expense metric, it's not necessarily just the raw score. They do make a deduction if you have consecutive years of deficits. So if you're running at a deficit for multiple years, they will reduce the total possible 10 points. And so that's something to be aware of. Administrative expenses, the lower the better here. So you can see they're definitely gearing towards how much of your organization's resources are going directly into meeting the mission, and they want to see low overhead. So administrative expenses at the lowest possible will give you the highest points available. The highest 10-point rating is given for administrative expense allocation of 0 to 15%. That number does cascade downward a bit depending on the industry sector. So for example, museums receive 10 points if their administrative expense load is anywhere from 0 to 17.5% of total. Whereas food banks only receive the 10 points available for this metric if their administrative expenses are 0 to 3% of total expenses.
When I see this slide, Mike, it's program expenses, the higher the better, administrative, lower the better. Well, we all know that, there is an allocation going on. There are estimates. What are your thoughts on how, the bias and the estimates involved? What are your thoughts on, how well an organization should be able to support these if they ever got called out on something like this?
Yeah, that's a great point, and something we talk about with our nonprofit clients annually, if not more frequently, is that expense allocation. Certainly there's shared resources. You're tight on individual employees. They're wearing multiple hats, touching program and administrative and fundraising. So there's always an allocation, which is an estimate, and that's okay. We always provide what we think are best practice methods for allocating those expenses. But it's also important to note that, again, these numbers are coming straight from your Form 990, just as is. Whereas on your audited financial statements, there'll be a little bit more storytelling of why your expense allocation is a certain load, how you determine those. Essentially, Charity Navigator doesn't have that, and they're just taking the numbers as is and making that decision.
All right, talk to me about the fundraising side.
Yeah, so we'll move on to the fundraising side. These 2 metrics are still within that financial efficiency subcategory of the financial health rating. So first being fundraising expenses, the 3 expense categories of program we talked about, administrative we talked about, and the third is fundraising expenses. The lower the better. So the lower, the more efficient your fundraising efforts, the higher points you'll receive. You can receive the 10 maximum points for this metric if your fundraising expenses as a percentage of total are 0 to 10%. For this particular metric, there's no adjustments by sector. It's the same for everybody. So you need to have fundraising efforts of 10% or less to receive the 10 points available. The last fundraising metric is around cost to raise a dollar. So this is the common, well-known term of fundraising efficiency, and as we all know, can fluctuate in a given year. The highest 10-point rating for this metric is given if your cost to raise a dollar is 10 cents or less. This is adjusted by sector. For example, food banks, again, receive 10 points if their cost to raise a dollar is 3 cents or less. So they have a lot more work to do to receive the 10 points available. You'll receive the most points for this metric for that 10 cents or less cost to raise a dollar. The midpoint, so you receive 5 points for this metric if your cost to raise a dollar is 20 cents to 35 cents. But as I mentioned, this will fluctuate, and I think you need to accept that. Organizations go through campaigns. If you're going through an endowment campaign or a capital campaign, your cost to raise a dollar, in theory, should be very low. As you come out of that campaign, it might spike and essentially hurt you because, again, they don't know that story. They're just looking at your numbers in that point in time.
Again, when I see this slide, I think that the word that comes to mind is supportable. I mean, yes, we all definitely want to have, we all want to excel. We want to have the highest score possible. I think we also want to make sure that whatever we put out there is supportable.
Absolutely. The last few financial metrics are switching gears. We talked about financial efficiency. These metrics are focusing on financial capacity. So it'll be interesting to talk a little bit about these because they are a little bit different measurement. The first is revenue growth. The higher the better. Is your organization growing annually, year after year, of top line revenue? Again, whether contributed or earned, they don't necessarily care. They're just taking total revenue. They are measuring this over a past period of 3 to 5 years, and it is tailored based on the sector your nonprofit serves in. It actually widely varies based on sector. Generally speaking, the maximum 10 points are given if your growth is 6 to 8% within that 3 to 5 year period. If you're in certain sectors, it'll typically be your raw growth percentage. So for example, if you grew 3%, you receive 3 points plus 1 or 2 points added on depending on what sector you're in. So generally speaking, if you're growing 5, 6, 7, 8%, you'll be doing well in this metric.
And if we can just go back to that one slide real quick. We should say, Mike, that growth of greater than 6 to 8% every single year, that's tough. I mean, realistically?
Absolutely, yeah. I would agree. That's tough. This is what it is. Again, I think our intent here is to show you that this is Charity Navigator's opinion of strong revenue growth. Naturally, there's differing opinions, but this is theirs. They're making your rating, and it goes out to that public. Donors may not know that you have to be hitting 6 to 8%. They just know you're a 3-star organization, and they don't know all the details. But I agree. That's a tough number.
All right. Well, let's talk about the program expense growth component. We did have a question that came in that said that a nonprofit was getting dinged because of a lack of growth in program spending. Maybe you can explain that here.
Yeah, that's a great point. So certainly need to grow revenue. They also want to see that you're growing your program expense. And again, the intent is, are you putting money into the mission for the organization, continually growing those efforts? So just as with revenue growth, program expense growth, the higher the better for this metric, similarly measured over a 3 to 5 year period. And it's actually pretty identical numbers. They want to see 6 to 8% growth to receive those 10 possible points. Just with revenue, that number is adjusted based on sectors, specific sectors you work in. But again, 5, 6, 7, 8% program expense growth over the 3 to 5 year period is considered success from Charity Navigator's perspective. So if you're an organization that's only growing your program function 1%, you're going to be receiving a low score for this financial metric. That's not sufficient enough in Charity Navigator's view. The last financial health metric in this financial capacity category is working capital ratio. This is the higher the number, the better situation you're in. All they're really getting at with working capital ratio is its liquidity, rainy day fund. Can you sustain your current spending habits for a future period. So what they're doing with this formula or calculation is taking working capital, which is current assets minus current liabilities, as of the end of your most recent fiscal year reported on your Form 990. They're excluding from those current assets any permanently restricted assets. So if you have an endowment with a heavy investment portfolio, it doesn't count. They're taking that out and then taking your working capital number, dividing it into your annual expenditures. And if, generally speaking, if that number comes out to greater than a year, if you have enough liquidity or working capital position to sustain spending over a year, you're in good shape and you'll get the 10 points available for this metric. But again, slightly modified for each sector. So again, the two examples I've been using, museums have it a little tougher. They need to have working capital to sustain spending for 3 years or more. Food banks only need working capital to sustain spending for 3 months or more. So wide variation based on sector. We would always say it's certainly prudent to have that rainy day fund or working capital to sustain for over a year at least.
Mike, I heard you say that it would they would take off any permanent or endowment component, but I didn't hear you say anything about the temp.
Right, included. Yeah, they're only saying that they're taking off permanently restricted. So the corpus that you have invested from any endowment. Okay. And that also doesn't include if you're an organization that has board designated quote unquote quasi endowment. They're not excluding that because they're only using the permanently restricted net asset balance that you're reporting on your Form 990.
All right. Or if you're in a capital campaign and you've got large receivables out there and maybe that's the corresponding credit is in the temp restricted net assets, you're still going to get credit for all of that as well.
Still get that. Yep.
Okay.
So that was a lot of the individual formulas and calculations they're using to really measure your financial health as an organization. We wanted to summarize that for you because there's multiple metrics. They're going in different directions. So what you're seeing now is really a summary. The higher the metric, the better is program expense allocation. They want more money being allocated to your programmatic function. They want higher revenue growth, higher program expense growth, and that higher working capital ratio to sustain future spending. The metrics where you want the lowest number possible, administrative expenses, so low overhead, fundraising expenses, again, same story. And then the cost to raise $1, your fundraising efficiency, they want as low as possible. Again, that one was 10 cents or less.
Thanks, Mike. And that takes us to our third polling question, which is when it comes to program expenses, the higher your score, the better. Is that true? A, B, false, or C, not sure? And again, this is just according to Charity Navigator. But when it comes to program expenses, the higher the score, the better. A, true, B, false, C, not sure. And again, if you've missed a question, make sure you answer this one. We'll close the polls here in about 3, 2, and 1. And it looks like close to 90% said true.
Yeah, which is great. Absolutely correct. The answer there was true. The more you spend on your mission, the more you're putting into your programmatic function, the higher rating score you'll receive for those financial metrics.
All right. So that was a lot of information, a lot to bite into. Let's kind of talk about maybe the conclusion, and some next steps.
Yeah, absolutely. So really to kind of wrap it up a little bit for you and talk about some closing points. We talked about all the rating systems, some of the context and the intent of Charity Navigator. I think what's important for you all to understand and really accept is an expectation that your scores or that star rating, it might fluctuate year to year, and that's perfectly okay. If you're that 4-star rated organization that drops to 3-star one year, you'll probably go back up to 4-star. It could just vary. You could be on the cusp, and maybe that cost to raise $1 just clips underneath the threshold. So it's okay for it to fluctuate on a year-to-year basis. Perfectly fine. Also, as we mentioned before, completely understand that donors and grantors are absolutely looking at your score. It's completely public information. It's not hard for them to gain access. It's one website. They type in your organization's name, and they can see your star rating. Lastly, tackle those easy wins. We talked about some of those policies and the transparency on your website. If you're not meeting some of those basic requirements for the Charity Navigator rating system, certainly try to tackle those and don't feel like it's a significant burden. Use your trusted business advisors, as Dean mentioned, to help you with policy templates, put those in place, get them uploaded on your website or available through documentation on your Form 990 so you get that credit within the rating system. So what's next? I mentioned before that the Charity Navigator, the current rating system, is based on those two primary pillars, financial health and accountability and transparency. And what it does not include is some measurement of impact or results of your mission, essentially. So we wanted to make sure you're aware that is something that's in the works for Charity Navigator. What they want to come out with is what they're calling Charity Navigator 3.0. A fitting name because they're going to add a third dimension of this rating system called results reporting. So they're going to try to come up, and they're still working on it as far as I know, of how to really measure that and on a consistent basis from organization to organization, which is naturally a difficult task. So for some background for you on what they've been doing in this plan is during 2015, they essentially did a pilot program. They evaluated 3,000 nonprofits nationwide and tried to look at results reporting metrics. They stopped that pilot program. They're currently in deliberation and discussions on essentially what to do next, how they can develop those metrics to be consistent. So that's all in the works. Just be aware that that's certainly the hot topic item in the nonprofit community. Charity Navigator knows that. They're trying to incorporate that into their rating system for donors to be seeing. But as far as we can look at this concept, it's a tough one. It's certainly hard to rate results reporting between museums and schools and performing arts centers. They all have very different ways of measuring their success within their mission.
Thanks, Mike. And the last of the 4 polling questions really quickly as we kind of wrap up our webinar today. Do you know your nonprofit's Charity Navigator rating? A, yes, B, no. Pretty simple, pretty quick answer, hopefully. Get those in. We'll close the polls here in 3, 2, and 1. It's actually a pretty big split. So it looks like 60% know their rating, 40% either don't know their rating or maybe they aren't rated.
Yeah, that's interesting. For those of you that don't know your rating, again, as I mentioned, how easy it is for donors to know your rating, it's easy for you. Log on today, Charity Navigator, type in your name, and you'll see your rating there. We've just armed you with a ton of information to really understand the nuts and bolts behind it. But by all means, whether you know your rating or if you don't, if you're confused about your score or how they're trying to measure your organization, we're here to help. Happy to look at your 990 and do some of the back-end calculations for you to help you understand.
So in conclusion, in this webinar we've covered, Charity Navigator's current rating system. We've identified the effect each rating has on fundraising and other essential functions, and we reviewed what CFOs need to know about these watchdog type of ratings. Now we can actually go to some questions. We've had a couple here. And the first one looks like somebody who was probably attending our financial FASB update last month, because the question was, has there been any commentary about adjusting the working capital ratio once the new financial statement standards are updated to with and without donor restrictions? Mike, any color there?
Yeah, that's a great, outstanding question because as it sounds like you're aware, they're getting rid of the 3 classifications of unrestricted, temporarily restricted, and permanently restricted net assets and really replacing with just with or without donor restriction. Nothing I've read has Charity Navigator looking into that. And although they certainly should, because as I mentioned before, with the working capital ratio, they're only excluding permanently restricted net assets. And when the new nonprofit financial reporting framework is fully in effect, those permanently restricted net assets will be lumped in with temp and just considered with donor restriction. So they'll certainly have to make an adjustment for that.
We got another question here, Mike. Yeah, you know what? I guess I didn't really hear you talk about this. How are investment or endowment earnings handled?
Yeah, that's a great point too. As we talked through some of those financial reporting metrics that they're measuring, none of them really incorporate market appreciation on your investment portfolio, whether restricted or not. They're not focusing on that, I would imagine, because it fluctuates significantly. The only way it does impact your ratings or your scores is that appreciation on the investment portfolio, the asset value goes up. To the extent it's unrestricted, it's included in that working capital ratio, and covering the hopefully multiple years that you have available to cover spending.
Okay, and I think this is probably one that is on many people's minds on the webinar. And it says, do you have any advice on how best to inform our board about our rating?
Yeah, great. I mean, certainly, first and foremost, inform your board on your rating. Make sure they know what your rating is, and start peeling back the layers on why that is, especially if you're not that 4-star organization. What metrics are you perhaps suffering at, so that they can help you make those decisions, guide you strategically moving forward. That's something we focus a lot on with our clients when we try to meet with our clients' board members at the end of an audit perhaps, or when we're presenting the Form 990. To the extent it's a good discussion point, we want to talk about your Charity Navigator rating, because we know it's out there, it's public information, and we want to help the board understand that rating system so they can help you out moving forward.
Especially with regards to the components that seemed like they were the easy wins, right? Do you put your audited financial statements on your website or not? That's something that you should definitely talk about with your board. You got to think about the cost benefit analysis of doing something like that.
Absolutely. Yep. Easy wins. Board members will love that. If you're a management position and you want to take an easy win with your board members, let them know that you don't have a conflict of interest policy, or your privacy policy is out of date, and they'll love to know that that's an easy win to put up on your website and accomplish that. And especially it'll bump your Charity Navigator score as well.
And that's actually an easy win for you as a CFO and the CFO organization, is to kind of be ahead of the curve and saying, hey, this is why, this is the effect, and this is what we can do in the positive outcome from it.
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, I think we're about out of time. So thanks to Mike and Dean for participating in today's webinar. Their contact information is up there on the screen. For those of you looking for CE, you'll receive your certificate of completion within 3 business days. For those of you who want the slides and a recording of today's webinar, I'll be sending that out today and or tomorrow, so you'll receive that shortly. Thanks so much, and we hope to see you at a future Armina webinar. Thanks.